Last month, Spotify Ads introduced the Podcast Streams campaign objective. While it's still in beta, it serves two main purposes. First, you may want to be looking at branding your podcast. You can do that with this objective. Or you may want to look at boosting listeners to a specific episode. You can also do that with this objective. So in this video, we will show you what podcast stream ads could look like when a user is on Spotify. We will show you the specs needed for each of the three ad formats, and then we will walk through a complete podcast stream campaign setup so you have a better understanding what to expect. With a brand new campaign objective for a very unique ad platform, I first want to show you what podcast streams ads could look like. Here we see an example of a full screen takeover ad. Clearly it's on a mobile device. I have a slide about the video specs coming up really soon, but in this example we see a fast-paced video with a little bit of text in the bottom. You see it, new episodes published weekly, and then the listen now call to action button. So hopefully already your mind is turning about what creative is potentially going to be needed if you're looking at consistently promoting episodes on your podcast. Let's look at more examples. Besides the full takeover ad, we see a variety of different options on how podcast stream ads can appear. One way could be the actual Spotify homepage. Next, they could be on individual episode or entire podcast pages. They can also be on the now playing view. And Spotify does mention that podcast stream ads can appear on either currently streaming podcasts or even when you're listening to music. And while the takeover ad example I showed you, as well as the three on the screen, are all mobile devices, podcast stream ads are also available on desktop. Next, let's cover a few of the metrics as well as the specs needed to run a podcast stream campaign. First, we'll look at how podcast streams are measured. On Spotify, a stream is any exposure with your ad within the past 14 days or the past 2 weeks. Any exposure. Whether it was visible in the now playing view, whether it was a full takeover, doesn't matter. It's all going to be considered the same as a stream for your ad. You'll be able to look at new listeners, and you'll see that within your campaign reporting. If anyone listened to your podcast for the first time after an ad interaction, you can then take those listeners and review the total number of streams that your entire amount of new listeners have performed. This helps you see that not only are you attracting new listeners, but those new listeners that you acquired from the campaign keep coming back and listening to more of your podcast. Let's look at the specs. Now, some of these are pretty technical. I'm not going to go over every single point. The main ones for audio, keep it 30 seconds or less. There you see the file type, keep your file size under 1 megabyte. Here's where it goes a little bit over my head. There's your sample rate, bit rate, and overall loudness. Probably not going to be an issue. For video requirements, again, 30 seconds or less, but there we see the two aspect ratios. There's your portrait, probably the most common, but landscape is there for desktop. Your max file size, 500 megabytes or less, and your file types will be a .mov or an MP4. For your logo and companion image, pretty straightforward. Keep your image a JPEG or a PNG, PNG, whatever you want to call it, and the image size must be 640 by 640. And then for the ad copy, we'll see when we create a campaign, the brand name must be within 30 characters or less. You get 140 characters for the tagline, and the call to action button, which we saw in all the examples. Every example that we saw from Spotify said listen now, but you do have the option to learn more and visit the profile. And if there's a CTA button, you must provide a URL, and we'll see that when we create the ad. So now let's hop into Spotify and walk through this setup. When you're in Spotify ads, go ahead and start creating a new campaign. And there we see the new campaign objective beta for podcast streams. After you've chosen your objective, of course, you need a campaign name, whatever you want to call it, and then click next. First, we have to start by naming a new ad set. I typed in something here. You're probably thinking that's really weird. But since Michelle and I don't have a podcast, I'm going to use one of my favorite Star Wars podcasts that I like to listen to. And this is the name of one of their episodes. So for this particular ad set, we're going to promote an individual episode of this podcast. Then search for the podcast on Spotify. So whatever your podcast name is, your client's podcast, whatever, there it is. And there we see you can update your location. It's defaulting to our account's home country, but you can filter down and look at specific locations by zip code, city, state, or province, with the option to bulk upload postal codes. Scrolling down a little bit, you have the options to update the age. Now, depending on the content you're trying to promote, you may need to look at specific age groups. You can go 21 plus, but here you see the option if you need to keep it 18 years or older. Depending on what your legal requirements are, there are your options to hand select that. If you need to choose by gender, you can go ahead, But then we look into interests and behaviors. Right now, we have none selected. And what Michelle and I talk about a lot when we're working with clients is that each of the ad platforms have unique targeting options. So in this case, since I'm using the Star Wars podcast as my example, I can look at specific interests. Maybe I want to scroll down and look at TV and film. That might be too long of a reach. So let's clear that out. Going back up, I can look at fan bases. We see some here that apply to this specific podcast, but as you can see, you can target other music. In this case, this one might be a little difficult, but maybe your podcast fits with specific music artists. If you want to get in front of fans of those specific artists, type them up, see if they pop up. Clearly, the more popular they are, more likely it's going to show up. Or maybe there are other podcasts that you know their fan base potentially want to listen to your podcast too. Search for them. See if you can add them to your account. There's specific music genres. This one will not apply to everyone who wants to promote their podcast, but it is an option. And then contextual playlists. Again, not that specific. So looking at specific fan bases would be one I would probably consider first, unless any of these higher level options is best suited for your podcast. Let me just go back up here. Fan bases. There you go. Just type in a few. That's fine. Next, here are the different ad formats. There's audio, and we gave the specs in the slides earlier. There's horizontal video, and then there's vertical video. So depending on which creative you have, you are going to be limited by placements. So choose which ones you have, and then look at your placement. This one I also do recommend leaving it automatic. Music only will be more difficult. Even though you can still target the users that we did above, only reaching to them on music limits your placements. For other Spotify campaign objectives, if you are promoting your music, yes, could totally make sense. But podcasts go well beyond music, so leave it as automatic. For relevant podcast topics, if you look at selecting the topics, it's a little bit different than the interests above. For the most part, it's the same, still pretty generic. And then if you need a sensitive topic filter, you can add this here and choose where you would want to exclude your podcast from being shown. Pretty standard in many of the platforms. I'm talking about tobacco, drugs, adult content, alcohol, whatever may make sense for your brand. Next, we can choose our average daily budget. Minimum is $15. Going to leave that as is. Or you can choose a lifetime budget. Minimum is $250. And as we see in many of the ad platforms, they can spend more than your daily budget. In Spotify's case, they can spend up to 2 times your daily budget, but they're going to average out over a calendar month. So be careful. Scrolling down, there's the ad schedule. Look at setting an end date. There's frequency capping. Adjust the numbers that may make sense to you. Can't change the goal. We talked about it. We're trying to get more streams and new listeners. And then if you look at pacing, it's going to look to deliver your ads all throughout the day. Since we chose daily, if you chose a lifetime budget, it's going to try to evenly space it out throughout the lifetime that you've set up. Or accelerated, it's spend my money as quickly as possible. So what did I choose for the ad format? I chose vertical video. Okay, let's go to next. And here's where we can create our ad. For now, we'll just name it. Notice that even though this is the official podcast name, it's over the limit. I got to remove something here. Then we need a tagline, something like that. Notice where the tagline is with 9 characters to spare. We have our ad language. Then we can choose our call to action. Here, I left it as listen now. And in this case, the default click-through URL that Spotify put in was the main show URL. Everything up here, in terms of my goal of the ad group, as well as the tagline, is talking about a specific episode. So I would need to pull the URL for that specific episode and paste it in there instead. If you remember the slides, you have to include the HTTPS. You can send users to a playlist page, leave it as the default one. It's up to you, depending on what your goals are. Could be something that you have to test around with to see what's giving you more streams from your ads. Next, companion visuals. I understand none of the stuff put together is going to make sense. But one thing I will say is that both of the images that I uploaded were definitely not 640 by 640. Whether you're pulling them from your asset library or uploading themselves, there will be an option to crop it to fit within the minimum size requirement. Next, we need to upload our video. Okay, I uploaded the video here. I'm not going to press play because I had to use a client video, but you can preview it, see what it looks like so you can make any edits if you need to, share it with others if they need to approve the ad before you launch a podcast stream campaign. But one thing to notice here, you cannot use music-only ads. Don't know why you would want to if you're trying to promote a podcast, but just make sure that you have your voiceover work included in your ad, no matter which of the ad formats you chose. So for now, let's just click Next. Review everything here. You can go back and make any changes if you need to. Of course, we need to add our payment information, so we're going to add that and then submit the campaign. Not only is our campaign pending approval, but our launch date is 4 days from now. And honestly, we're not going to run it anyway. But within the campaign, you can go up to ad sets. I can duplicate the ad set. And remember that the ad format, audio, horizontal, vertical video, was set at the ad set level. So if you want to test out different ad formats, create different ad sets for it. As we already saw, targeting options live at the ad set level. But within a particular ad set, we get to the ads tab. This was just one. If you want to duplicate it to test out other videos, different messages, different landing pages, different calls to action, here's where you would do it. I already talked about potentially the ways that you may want to test different landing pages. Your main podcast page versus individual episodes. If you don't know where to start, there's a variety of ways that you can test. Like in this particular case, it is a trailer for a new TV show coming out. So if it's still hot and in the moment, you may want to capitalize on all the buzz from this trailer dropping. Make it a little bit more recent. Maybe some of your other podcast episodes are evergreen content. That would just be a good introduction to your podcast. That might be set up for a different campaign or ad set depending on the budget. Doesn't always have to be the most recent podcast that you have come out. Try to capitalize on those certain moments depending on what's going on, whether it's important sporting events, topical news that's going on at the moment, whatever that may be, as long as it coincides with the goals of your campaign. And then at all three of these levels, you'll be able to review performance. Because the columns that I initially talked about in the beginning, new ones specifically for this campaign, we only see streams. We don't see any of the new listener ones that I mentioned. I'm going to cancel out of this. And then from here, I'm going to go and view the report for the specific ad set. This link does not exist at the campaign level. Nothing's running yet, so clearly we can't see anything there. But if you scroll down to podcast engagement, here's where we see the newer metrics. There's our streams, which that one's not new, but then there's the total new listeners as well as your total listeners. So this will give us different information based on the specific ad set of how your current setup is working. Hopefully these will be pushed into the other main columns to make the viewing of it easier, especially across a variety of ad sets and ads, but it probably depends on how this new objective does. But if you're looking to promote a podcast on Spotify, it's pretty much a no-brainer. But really, what other options do you have? Test it out, let it run for a little bit, and please let us know in the comments how this new objective is working for your podcast.
Thanks for watching our video. We really appreciate it. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up below. If you really liked it, maybe think about subscribing to the Paid Media Pros YouTube channel and you'll get alerted every time a new video drops.
If you really liked it, you can help support the channel by checking out some of the t-shirts that we're wearing on our merch shelf, as well as looking at the Super Thanks button.